what to do and what I do when one of my teams is struggling. You've got to drill down into what are the issues that are really impacting your athletes so you can chart your path forward. Maybe your cultural problem rests with conversations that are happening outside of the gym. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Cheer Biz Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Cotton, and today we are going to be talking about what I do when one of my teams is struggling. Now, before we get into the episode, make sure you've gone over to Cheer Gym Owners if you're a gym owner and you have joined that Facebook group. And you've also joined All-Star Cheer Coaches and Owners if you are a coach or a coach and owner to join us in the discussions that we're having in those groups. If you're learning or if you're interested in learning more about how to join the academy, head on over to nextgenowners.com. Now, if you are a gym owner who is setting your pricing right now, you are getting ready to head into your next season, I'm going to tell you, you need to get my book, Charge What You're Worth, the Cheer Pricing Handbook. It can save you so much work. Learn from my painful lessons on how to set your pricing correctly so you, your gym, and your staff can thrive with correct pricing. You can grow your membership and you can actually make all the ends meet that you need to make meet. Now, I want to get into the episode because this is just heavy on my mind. It's been something I've been thinking about a whole lot lately, and it is what to do and what I do when one of my teams is struggling. And I'm going to talk about what I do when one of my teams in the gym is struggling, and what one of my teams that I'm coaching is struggling, like what I'm doing in those circumstances. I spend a lot of time coaching business owners. I spend a lot of time working on my various companies, but believe it or not, what oftentimes occupies my spare thoughts is my cheerleading teams, my athletes that I'm coaching. And when it's not them, it is other athletes for programs that I work with through dream camps, or I do choreography for, or I are just friends that I want to see be successful. I'm thinking about those teams and how to make them more successful and what it is that we can do to be better coaches for those athletes. And I think it is a unique scenario when you as a coach are like, my team's struggling and I'm not sure what the problem is. So I want to tell you kind of what I do and what I do for different issues and how I approach those things as a coach with 23 years of coaching experience at a relatively elite level, coaching world's athletes and elite level 4 athletes and working with some of the greatest college cheerleaders, et cetera. You know, what it is that I do when I find my teams or my athletes are struggling. So first and foremost, the number one thing I have to do is I have to figure out what is the struggle, because sometimes what you're seeing is a symptom of the actual issue. And so while you may be looking at your team and going, man, they just can't hit a routine. And so you think, well, the issue is the skills. What you really have to look at is what is the symptom coming from? Like, what is the underlying root cause that you need to focus on? And that could be culture, that could be conditioning, that could be experience, that could be understanding of the skill, that could also be a coaching issue. So you've got to drill down into what are the issues that are really impacting your athletes so you can chart your path forward. You've got to know, hey, these are the things that I am seeing, and these are the actual issues. So you're fixing the real problem, and you're not just putting a Band-Aid on a symptom and not actually fixing the root issue. And where I see this the most often with coaches is we focus a lot on coaching the skill and coaching the routine, and we don't look at what's happening on the mat culturally as often. Like we sometimes forget that that is as important, or oftentimes even more important than coaching the specific skill or the specific moment in time, because overall the culture on the mat is really, really important for the team's overall success. And on top of that, I didn't even mention this before, but what's the culture after they get off the mat? Maybe your cultural problem rests with conversations that are happening outside of the gym. It's the conversation in the car ride home, or the parents complaining about it, or the athletes in their group chat complaining about things and creating a negative atmosphere. And everything I'm going to tell you about, everything I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to talk about my own personal experiences, because I'm not going to sit up here and say I'm perfect and I've always done everything right, and I've never had culture issues, and I've never had parent room issues, and I've never had effort issues. I've had every single one of them, and I've had almost every single one of them more than once. Now you would say, well, that means you didn't learn your lesson. And I would say maybe, but also that everything changes and ebbs and flows, and what works one year doesn't always work the next year. And you have to constantly be evolving and shifting and adjusting and finding what is right. That's what makes a great coach, is the ability to pivot and realize that what was working before is no longer working, and you need to adjust so you can get your team on the right track. The first thing I do is I look at what the problem is. And once I identify that problem, I'm going to figure out that what I as a coach can do to influence it. Because ultimately, I believe in extreme ownership. I've read the book by Jocko Willink multiple times. I believe it is a fantastic book from a leadership perspective. And I believe that ultimately, it all comes down to the leader of the group and the buck stops with me kind of mindset. That's a really crummy position when you're the owner, because that even says that when my coaches are not doing their job, I have to look back on, okay, where did I mess up? The buck stops with me. And it could be as simple as I just failed to hold my staff accountable to the standards that I previously set. So we're going to kind of get into all of these things. And I did not script this out ahead of time, you guys. So I'm literally just speaking to you from the top of the bald noggin on my thoughts in regard to this. So looking at a culture issue first, let's talk about that one, because that one's kind of deep. I'm going to say, what am I as a coach needing to change or enforce to shift the culture? Now, I've seen this a couple different ways. I've had a year, I've talked about it before, where my level 4 team, the culture was absolutely, it was very toxic. And it was very toxic because of a couple of athletes who were a little bit big for their britches. They felt that they motivated people better by tearing them down than by building them up. And it was made even worse because they were somewhat hypocritical. They would, just kind of yell at everyone. And it was do as I say, not as I do. Like, they were not the hardest working athlete on the team. They were not the one always doing the extra reps. They were not the one who did every single tumbling pass and was in every single stunt. They just were the ones with the highest demands of everyone else. And they thought it was their job to tell everyone what to do. And it created a very negative atmosphere on the team, and a very much like, well, my routine hit, yours didn't. This was back when I hit a personal zero thing was like really popular, and everyone was saying, well, I had a personal zero. Well, who cares if you had a personal zero? That literally doesn't matter. You don't get a first place trophy and then Susie gets a last place trophy. You all get the last place trophy, aka no trophy. So like, stop. Who cares? Like, yes, I get it's okay to be like, hey, you did your best. And I've had that conversation. I've had that conversation with athletes before, like, hey, stuff happens. Like, you did your job, you did your best, but like, we as a whole didn't succeed today, to just kind of lift their spirits. But it's not you hit a personal zero and you're perfect and everyone else is wrong. It's just, yeah, you did your best today. You did great. You did a good job. And that's all you can control, is control yourself. So I've had that situation, and I'll talk you through kind of how I dealt with that if you haven't listened to those episodes before. And then I've had a situation more recently where the culture on both of my teams was starting to shift, and we were starting to get very unfocused and just not really dialed in on both of my level 4 and my level 6 team, which are both very different teams, and what we did to fix that. So on the first one, the really negative group, what I did was I enacted I read the book Legacy. I've talked about it before. It's one of my favorite books from a culture perspective. And I completely reformatted the way we did everything with the team. I created a team initialism, a team set of values. I really started to focus in on those and promoting those as the emphasis of the team, and those values directly related to the behaviors that I wanted to see that were in contradiction to the behaviors that I had been seeing. We started to hold athletes more accountable. We started to be very direct with our feedback to athletes, specifically as it related to the culture of the team. And we started to make a lot more cultural corrections than simply skill corrections. It was much more about how you spoke to one another and how you valued one another than it was about the skill that you put on the mat. And so that became our focus with that team, and took about a year and a half. Really, it was a full additional season because a couple of the toxic athletes were kind of still around and they didn't fully grow out of their behaviors. It wasn't until basically a full year after, like a full season after we enacted these things, that it really like got majorly better and we had a significant turnaround on the team. And those things just do take time, especially the longer that cultural problem, that cultural cancer kind of metastasizes, the longer that goes, the harder it is going to be to root out and the longer it's going to take. Now, for my teams this year that I kind of had this go on with, my level 6 team has been struggling. They are fiercely talented, like very, very talented group of athletes. But they're one of those groups of athletes that gets the critique or the compliment that I hate getting so much, which is, oh, they have so much potential, which means they didn't live up to it. Lots of talent, lots of tumbling, lots of ability to stunt, probably the best partner stunting senior co-ed small for sure team in the country, but we can't hit our group stunts very well. And we balk on tumbling in competition, and we just make like lazy mistakes that cost us major points. Like we legitimately, I'm not joking, and I'm going to call myself out here. I had a world's level 6 team at a world's bid event that scored an 85 on day 2 because they dropped an elite skill that made it so they didn't get their level appropriate skill afterwards. So we got a 3 on baseline stunt difficulty, only got one of our true stunt drivers, and we didn't get our standing tumbling driver because kids balked on tumbling. So we had like 6 points that we just did not get because of dropped skills, poor choreography decisions on my end, and kids just not hitting stunts. That team came in after that and was unfocused and was like, oh, like goofing off, not really checked in, not really locked in to their practices, which I can understand that bad things happen and teams aren't successful. But then when you come back to practice and you're not locked in, I was like, well, I had a meeting with my other coaches. I was like, what do we need to change? Like, we need to fix this and we need to fix it now, which they were all in agreement. Like we all were kind of like, we need to talk and figure this out. And at the same time, my level 4 team, which has scored up until a weekend ago, had one of the highest scores in the Pacific Northwest in D2 with a 98.7 or 98.9333 repeating. They had one of the highest scores. They were like starting to drop more and more and like just looking sloppy and not really checked in and not performing and not doing their things in practice. We were like, what is going on? And we had to take a hard look and say, you know what? We haven't been enforcing the standard. Like we haven't been as strict as we need to be. We've been a little bit more laid back with both of our teams. And it's even worse with our world's team right now because they're not executing and we need to step it up. So I sent out a text message that night and I was like, we haven't held you guys accountable. That's on us. It's going to change. Moving forward, you're going to, these are the practice attire you're going to wear to practice. Like we'd gotten lax on those things. Your jewelry's going to be out. We've gotten lax on that. You're going to have a bow in your hair. We hadn't even enforced that. Like you're going to come and you're going to be game time ready when you show up for practice. No exceptions. And if you're not, there's going to be a consequence. Because for us, that was like you're mentally checking into practice. You're showing that you care when you're thinking about practicing, wearing the right attire and putting in your bow and like doing those things. It's like putting on your pads for football. It's like I'm checking in for practice as opposed to like walking in your oversized baggy nonsense and just looking a hot mess express. I was like, we're not doing that. We're just changing it. And it's made a huge difference. In the past month, we've seen a drastic change on both of the teams. Now, my world's team is still not hitting, which then is going to bring me kind of to my next point of one of the things that I do when teams are still struggling. So when we're struggling, then I look at, okay, is it a conditioning thing? Is it a skill understanding thing? Like what is the issue? And what I find myself oftentimes defaulting to is if it's not a conditioning issue, oftentimes is a lack of attention on the skill in isolation. And I think Jason recently mentioned this on one of his episodes where he talked about, you need to do a skill so many times that it's like repetitive for them, and it's easy and it's no longer stressful. And I think that oftentimes as coaches, we can want to rush through it, or we can forget that it's important to go back and remember the basics, and remember that like even the best NBA players warm up for the game and they shoot their free throws and they shoot their, static 3-pointers before they're trying to, do a fadeaway jumper and all of those things. And that's because focusing on the basics is really important. So with those teams, it's like, hey, focus on drilling down and making sure the athletes remember and understand how to execute the skill. And then after they've executed it correctly, don't just be like, great, you've got it. Do great. That was perfect. Recreate it and do it again. Great. Recreate it and do it again. Great. Recreate it and do it again. And then do the same thing the next practice and the next practice and the next practice. The real issue becomes is that we're oftentimes as coaches too impatient, and as athletes, we're too impatient to really master the skill. We want to move on. We want to get to the full outs. We think that that's where it's important. And it is important to throw full out. I'm not saying it's not, but we neglect the building the good habits and building the basics. And you need to train down to that level of repetitively doing it exceptionally. So then in the context of a routine, they can hit it consistently. That's why you'll oftentimes find, and I'm not saying you should make changes to a routine that's not successful, but that's why you'll oftentimes find that teams that make the least amount of changes to their routine throughout the season are the ones who like consistently are smacking. And it's because they've had the most amount of time to hit their routine. They've had the most amount of time to become comfortable, and for the Flyers to truly perform and execute all the skills exactly how they're supposed to, and for the bases to freeze because they know what it's going to happen because they've done it 100,000 times. And so those are like some big things that I go back to with athletes when they are struggling to be successful. I want to focus on where is the root problem, and then figuring out exactly what it is I need to focus on to fix that problem. And it might be a number of things at the same time. You can have a culture issue and a conditioning issue and a lack of understanding for skills all at the same time, which means you just have a lot more work to do. But if you're in this position, you're not alone. What I would encourage you to do, the last thing that I do, I think it is really important, is reach out for help. Like, you don't have to go through this alone. Even if you're a small gym owner, even if you don't have any staff, even if you only have one other staff member, like, reach out, get help, get other eyeballs, ask someone to watch your routine, give you feedback. The people who get through these things are the people who are humble and get their ego out of the way. Like, check that thing at the door. You don't need it. It's doing you no favors. Ask for help. There are so many people in this sport that want you to be successful, or they're more than willing to help just out of the goodness of their heart, because they love cheer and they know what it's like to be that person, that you should reach out. Now, I'm not saying take advantage of people. I'm not saying that there aren't great people that you should pay. I make my living doing this kind of stuff. So I certainly believe that you should charge what you're worth. Title of my book. But I do think that you should reach out, especially to friends and people that you know. If you're in the academy, reach out to academy members, like, see if you can get some feedback from people. I've seen people do it before. I've given feedback to people before. Like, reach out and use your resources and check your ego at the door. Figure out what's going on, get feedback on your routine, get feedback on your skills. Heck, bring in a guest voice. A friend of mine recently did this for her team, and talk about like checking your ego. She is relatively close to me, and we both have a level 4. And so next weekend, or I guess 2 weekends from now, we'll be competing against each other for the paid summit bids. She was like, hey, can you help? And I was like, yes, of course. And I went up and worked with her level 4 team that's going to compete with mine, and like to try to help them get to where they were hitting. And then she talked to our other friend, I've talked about her a million times on the podcast, who also has a level 4 team and is a great coach. Their level 4 team is really successful. And she's also going to be competing against us throughout the year for summit bids. And they're actually in the same division. Her and I are not in the same division. We just go against each other for summit bids because we're medium and they're small. They're in the same division. And she even reached out to her and said, hey, can you help? And she, of course, said, yes, I'll come down, and helped out and helped coach them for a practice and give them advice and just try and build them up and build up their confidence, just change things up. And you know what? That team went out and just crushed it at CheerSport and hit a 0. And they hadn't hit 0 before. So like, such an amazing thing. And I'm sitting here watching their video and getting a little teary eyed watching them, celebrate and hug each other, and like that joy, even though they didn't win, like they hit a great routine at CheerSport. Like, how cool is that? It's just really, really awesome. So reach out and get help, ask for advice, bring a guest in, change things up, switch up coaches, have another coach from your gym come coach a practice. Like, it's all good. They're all good ideas. Wherever you're at, just know that you're not alone. We're all struggling. It's that time of year where burnout is real and you're thinking about next year, but you got kids talking about not coming back, but you got kids, like there's just a lot to think about. You're not alone. You still have enough time to turn it around if you have a team that's struggling. Like there's not a lot of time left in the season, but there's a lot of time left in the season if you use it the right way. So I hope this helped. As always, share it with someone who you think needs to listen to it. Thank you for listening. And with that, we'll catch you on the next episode.